In many civilized countries, they understand the natural rhythm of the human being is to eat a full meal and then have a slight siesta. Oops, sorry. However, we hope that the events of this afternoon will be so fascinating that you will not need a siesta and you will stay awake for the whole thing. I'm Renee Kogel. I am a Madri Ka, that strange kind of being that the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism has created. In my mother's mind, since mother comes from the old school, I'm a rabbi, and she introduces me that way. This is my daughter, the rabbi, and I say to her, Mom, I'm not a rabbi. She says, you marry people? You're a rabbi. So, it is my pleasure this afternoon to be able to introduce our next speaker. Several books were published recently that have described the historical context in which the evolution of American Jewish identity has taken place. And so we are honored this afternoon to have with us one of the authors of these books. Dr. Joselit is a distinguished historian, lecturer, and museum curator. Jenna Weissman Joselit, is the author, most recently, of this book I just mentioned, The Wonders of America, Reinventing Jewish Culture, 1880 to 1950, a book which has been hailed by critics as a felicitously written, splendidly researched, and mesmerizing, unquote. A fellow of the Center for the Study of American Religion at Princeton University, she teaches modern Jewish history as well as American social and religious history at NYU. In addition to her teaching and writing, Jenna Weissman Joselit has served as the curator of exhibitions at museums around the country, from the Jewish Museum in New York to the Minnesota Historical Society in Minneapolis. She is currently working on an exhibition for the Newark Museum on the social history of jewelry. Professor Joselit's paper, The Unsynagogued, is an attempt to place today's discussion of the unaffiliated in historical perspective. And she will, with your indulgence, she will vary the format of the program somewhat by involving you, the audience, into her presentation, and we will kind of see how that will work. Dr. Dunn. Thank you.
In 1902, can you all hear me? At a gathering much like this one, a gathering of intellectuals and concerned religious leaders, a churchman by the name of Robert Graham took a hard and searching look at religious life in America's cities, and he found it wanting. There is, he wrote, there is, above and below, and beyond and beneath the ordinary congregations that attend our churches, a vast mass of men who need to be reached and who are not reached, he observed. Where was this vast mass of men? Well, according to Graham and other contemporary students of American religious life, the men were in the neighborhood saloon. A welcoming alternative to the rather cushioned and carpeted church, the local pub had single-handedly supplanted the sanctuary, or so it appeared to many American religious authorities of the time. At the very least, the saloon appeared to claim the loyalty of as many men as did the churches. Those who found sanctuary amid the stained glass and polished brass of the neighborhood saloon were known as the unchurched, or as the out of church. And as one century drew to a close and another began, the number of the unchurched seemed steadily and inexorably to rise. Much the same could be said of the unsynagogued. For when it came to synagogue attendance, especially in America's large cities, the faithful, the synagogued, diminished in number, while the unsynagogued grew more numerous still. In this instance, though, it wasn't demon rum so much as the demon of indifference that kept many American Jews at arm's length from the neighborhood shul. Surveying the sanctuary half empty on a Shabbat, Hungarian Rabbi Moshe or Moses Weinberger deplored what he called America's terribly degenerate spiritual situation. Contemporary American Jews, he wrote in 1887, Contemporary American Jews have grown arrogant and lax. They've rejected the yoke of the Torah and the discipline of Talmud study in favor of 1 hour of contentment spent listening to a sweet-singing chazan. Were that not enough, notes Weinberger, and I quote now from his account, every ne'er-do-well, every bitter, unemployable man in tight straits, and every lazy good-for-nothing has become a ritual expert of one kind or another, officiating at marriages and funerals, performing circumcisions, and in general giving bona fide rabbis a bad name. As for preachers, Weinberger tells us, well, they're no better. Time and time again, they rehearse the same stale speech. Why, writes Weinberger, there's one reverend who has but one sermon, which is carried around in his pocket for over 10 years, never deviating from it, even to the extent of changing one word. Well, he says, what's the sin of that? Doesn't everyone preach in America? Don't tailors and shoemakers give sermons? Tailors, shoemakers, rabbis, preachers, no one, it seemed, was exempt from Weinberger's tongue lashing. Women, however, moved the good rabbi to new rhetorical heights. How awesome, he says, how awesome is the strength of America. In a single year, America transforms women who once ate salty fish and smelly lentils with little or no compunction, women who wouldn't handle money on Yontif even with their little pinky, sweet little women like Rachel, the wife of Reb Yaakov. America has transformed them in less than a year into a community of brash, irreligious termagants, Mrs. Jacobs. And then he concludes, the Haskalah, the Enlightenment of Berlin and Europe put together, did not accomplish as much in half a century as a single year in America. What then was a pious Jew to do? Well, counsels Weinberger, listen to me and stay home. If you come to America, he says, nothing will be left for you to do except dressing in black, wrapping yourself up in shrouds, and rolling from darkness to abyss. For such great success, he says, you don't need America. You don't need to endanger your life and your soul by crossing great stretches of water. And so, my faithful advice to you, dear friend, is to stand firm and stay where you are. Over the next 2 decades, as East European Jews en masse chose to disregard Weinberger's advice by migrating in the millions to America, not surprisingly, the number of rabbinic Cassandras continued to multiply as well. Denouncing the anomie, the hefker of America, they generated a lively genre of writing, religious protest literature, whose insights into and animadversions on American Judaism bear close scrutiny. Take, for example, the writings of Solomon Foster, a Newark rabbi of the Reform persuasion, who in 1909, at his own expense, publishes a booklet entitled The Working Man and the Synagogue. With a keen sociological eye, Foster explores in close detail why so many American Jews, especially those of immigrant and working class background, acquire what he calls the easy habit of antagonism towards the synagogue. Interviewing a wide range of people, from labor leaders and rabbis to social workers and their clients, the Newark rabbi discovers that most American Jews in the early years of the 20th century had become estranged from the synagogue, or at best, simply indifferent. But when faced with the facts, Foster, unlike Weinberger, does not counsel despair. Far more of an optimist than his Hungarian counterpart, the Newark rabbi firmly believed that the synagogue had much to offer American Jews, provided it stayed true to itself. The synagogue, he writes in 1909, should not be converted into a political platform, or it shouldn't be changed into a lecture forum from which learned disquisitions on every conceivable literary and scientific theory be delivered. For the American synagogue to flourish, suggests Rabbi Foster, it must do the work which no other institution in America is equipped to do. That is, to keep alive and intensify the religious consciousness of the Jews. In the years that followed Foster's publication, concern over the synagogue's viability and its slippery hold on the collective loyalty of American Jewry remained high, culminating in 1918 in a fascinating statistical study whose author was then a young professor of homiletics at JTS. I'm referring, of course, to Mordechai Kaplan. And the study is entitled Affiliation with the Synagogue. It's a case study of synagogue life in New York, a city which the New York Times at the time described as America's Great Ghetto. You have a very condensed version of this statistical study in your packet, and I suggest at this point that you pull it out. It's the second document in your packet.
Document.
Everybody have it?
Now, what does it look like?
It's a white piece of paper with lots of little numbers on it.
That's it.
Yes, it's the second page of this packet. The top of the packet says American Hebrew. Yes,
Oh, there it is.
this is what it looks like.
Here.
Yeah, it's the packet that says colloquium on the front.
Creator Wilder.
Okay. Can we please be quiet? Thank you.
Those of you who have succeeded in locating, hold on to it. We'll return to it in a second. Kaplan is writing in 1918, writing during the First World War, and for him at the time, the American synagogue was in a parlous state. Attendance and membership were down, and what he called the Jewish sentiment for the synagogue, the sentiment that has sustained the synagogue over the millennia, had noticeably weakened. Speaking passionately of American Jewry's imminent disintegration, again, it's 1918, we're imminently disintegrating, Kaplan urged American Jews of all denominations to work together to restore the synagogue to its primacy. Kaplan says, all of the possible material and moral resources of the entire American Jewish community must be concentrated upon the aim of saving the synagogue from impending ruin. Now, Kaplan's doomsaying didn't rest on rhetoric alone, but was supported by a massive data, by statistics, or by what Kaplan liked to call the cold figures. And so you see, in neat tabular form and through the prism of percentages, Kaplan lays out for the concerned American Jewish reader the salient factors and features of New York synagogue life, bringing to bear such variables, his word, variables as geography, demography, seating capacity, and history. Kaplan clinically attempts to demonstrate the, quote, alarming condition into which New York synagogues have fallen. Now, it's interesting to note that while in an American Jewish context, the use of statistics in 1918, if not in 1995, was somewhat novel, Kaplan's methodology was anything but new. For years, or at least since the 1880s, statistics, or more to the point, sociology, the science that blesses, it was called, sociology had become the language of choice of progressive theologians everywhere. In New York, for instance, the Federation of Churches, a Protestant organization devoted to solving what it called the problems of applied Christianity, the Federation pioneered the use of statistical surveys and census tracts to guide the church in New York. Unprecedented in their scope, depth, and methodological sophistication, these religious surveys placed proselytizing on an explicitly sociological basis. In Kaplan's use of statistics, then, he's following a well-established tradition of enlisting social science in the service of religion. And yet, for all the seeming dispassion and empiricism of his cold figures, Kaplan's methodology rests on several key cultural assumptions. Assumption number one. First, there's the assumption that the well-being and the vitality of Jewish identity in America is defined, as a matter of course, in terms of formal synagogue affiliation. A healthy Jewry, by Kaplan's lights in 1918, a healthy Jewry is a shul-going Jewry. Or, to use Kaplan's explicit phrase, a healthy Jewry is composed of synagogue Jews. To put it yet another way, Kaplan's analysis is couched in terms of Judaism rather than Jewishness. In other words, you didn't get it when normatively defined, Jewish identity in America, at least circa 1918, is taken to be a fundamentally religious notion. The second assumption on which this study rests is the primacy of numbers. Kaplan's study not only inaugurated, but also legitimated, perhaps even sanctified, a mode of analysis that continues unabated today. That is, the almost salvific belief that identity and commitment can be accurately measured and contained. Since Kaplan's day, the American Jewish community, with all due respect, has been busily engaged in constructing inventories of Jewishness, in which the messy imprecision of identity is neatly reduced to a series of charts, graphs, and the formulae of multiple regression analysis. So, what does Kaplan find, or as he puts it in his text, what are some of the truths that stand out as significant? Take a quick look. Tell me what strikes you as you eyeball this particular document.
It's very small. That's right.
Hard to read. Okay.
That's the point.
That's good. Would you say more about that? It's hard to read. I reduced it. In real life, this thing unfurls like a banner. It's in several pages, and it just unfurls, and this was the best I can do. But I think that's precisely the point. There is what here on this page, even though it's tiny. There's a lot of stuff.
Right.
There's a lot of material, and it's all neatly, compactly put together. So he's trying to show the distribution of synagogues in the various Kehillah districts of New York at the time. There was an attempt to create an organized Jewish structure. They called it a Kehillah, after a pre-modern name for the Jewish community, or Gemeinde. And the title goes on to say it also introduces the salient features of those synagogues. So start with geography, those of you who can manage to read this. Anything strike you in terms of geography here?
They all lived in my neighborhood.
They all live in the neighborhood. Beyond that. Well, what becomes clear is that some neighborhoods are dense with synagogues, and others have hardly any. What he calls the Delancey area has tons of synagogues, whereas Queens has very few. The other thing that he emphasizes is that there aren't enough seats to accommodate the entire population of New York Jewry. Now, if you notice at the bottom, he estimates, he has a column called seating capacity, and he says there are 381 and so on, 1,000 seats in what he calls permanent synagogues, and then there's another 163,000 in temporary. And then he goes on to say, which is not in this chart, that American New York Jewry at the time is estimated to be at 1.5 million. If you leave out the children, who account by his lights for 30%, and you leave out 10%, you account for 10% of adolescent girls, whom he writes, unfortunately, have hardly any place in the synagogue. You take all those groups out, and one might, he says, reasonably expect that there be 900,000 seats. We find, however, Kaplan soberly reports, that the total seating capacity in permanent standing synagogues is less than half that amount. And then he goes on to say that when all of the statistics are tabulated, when you generously include the temporary synagogues, which we'll talk about in a second, when you talk about Stieblach, that don't figure in this, when you put it all together, the bottom line, he says, is that the synagogue has lost its hold on more than 1/2 of the entire Jewish community in the largest Jewish community in the world. Another salient feature, what about language? Anything strike you here about language?
Yeah, Yiddish used extensively.
Right. And how is Yiddish used extensively?
By his basis for announcements, public announcements.
Right. And what's the language of prayer?
Hebrew and English.
Right. But largely Hebrew is the language of prayer. But when it comes to the public language of the service and the sermon, which is a particular interest to Kaplan, English is conspicuously absent. He, in fact, goes on to say that when one looks at the seats, the available seats in permanent synagogues, there are only 39,000 seats where English sermons are preached. Now, for some of us, that might be a cause for celebration. For Kaplan in 1918, that statistic suggested that American Jewish institutions, particularly the synagogue, was in a dire situation. He goes on to say that the absence of English language sermons has made it clear that in New York, at least, less than 1/5 of American synagogues have reckoned with America, have reckoned with the environment. A fighting phrase, I think. And what it suggests and highlights is the emphasis that progressive rabbis like Kaplan placed on the servant, a device which they widely saw as some kind of panacea or antidote to whatever ailed American Jewry. Admittedly, the English language sermon was not without its critics. Moshe Weinberger, whom we've encountered earlier, had nothing nice to say about it. Nor, for example, did Leah Morton, a writer of the 1920s, who frequently complained about the sermon's dulling effect on its listeners. She writes, "In the pews of the synagogue, the congregation sits as if at a lecture, immovable, quiet, when almost, she says, one almost expects well-bred applause, but little else, at the conclusion of the prayer service." Adds a third observer, Reform Rabbi Israel Harburg, "One of the greatest errors we as rabbis have committed is the emphasis we have laid upon the sermon." He writes, 1937, "Either we overrate the intelligence of the people by talking above their heads, or else we underrate them by talking down to them. In fact, when all the facts are in," says Rabbi Harburg, "it's quite plausible to assume that the inapplicability of our sermons to the needs of many of our people is a major contributing factor to their indifference to synagogue attendance." Harburg, though, was in the minority. Most rabbis of an avowedly modern caste placed great faith in the sermon, which they believed to be a great boon to Judaism. The high point of the synagogue service, the sermon, it seemed, afforded the rabbi the opportunity not only to display his erudition, his verbal prowess, and his big vocabulary, but also to strengthen his congregants' ties to Judaism and to one another. In a modern synagogue, we are told, it is the sermons delivered by the rabbi that affords a means of contact with the congregation. Said Rabbi Leo Young, a contemporary of Kaplan, the sermon stimulates the will to Jewishness. Parenthetically, it's worth noting that Kaplan's stake in the sermon was as much personal as professional. He was hired at the turn of the century as the English-speaking rabbi at Kehilloth Jeshurun, an affluent Orthodox synagogue on Manhattan's Upper East Side. But one day, right before Rosh Hashanah in 1904, he was forced to defer to his more senior rabbinic colleague, Yaakov David Volofsky, a.k.a. the Slutsker Rav, who in 1904 insisted on delivering the Rosh Hashanah sermon in Yiddish, that the Slutsker Rav had publicly and repeatedly denounced the English language sermon as a disgrace to Judaism and one likely to open the floodgates to apostasy, compounded matters further, causing what in another language would be called a cause célèbre. Following Rosh Hashanah and the Slutsker Rav's performance, the city's Jewish newspapers traded accusations back and forth. Said one newspaper, "If it's true that Yiddish was preferred to English on religious grounds, that's not only an insult to the young Kaplan, it's a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name." Kaplan, uncharacteristically, remained silent throughout this episode. Many years later, however, he referred to this event in his diary, noting at the time that to this very, very day, the Slutsker Rav lives in my imagination as a good deal of a bully. Well, whether rendered in Yiddish or in English, belief in the primacy of the synagogue was an American Jewish article of faith. Writing in 1918, Kaplan shares that belief. He, too, conceives of the synagogue as a house of worship. Fine-tuning, or as he puts it, rehabilitating the synagogue is his mandate, not restructuring or reinterpreting. Restructuring would come later, in fact, just a few short years later. In 1921, Kaplan comes to a conference and he delivers a paper entitled "The Function and the Organization of a Synagogue," in which he now attacks the synagogue for what he calls its spiritual impotence. Adumbrating his later work, Judaism as a Civilization, which he published in 1934, Kaplan in 1921 urges post-war American Jewry to return the synagogue to its pre-modern state, where it functioned not only as a house of worship, but as a place in which the social inheritance or civilization of the Jews was transmitted. Back in 1918, though, at the time of the statistical study you've tried to look at, Kaplan still conceived of the synagogue as a house of worship. In the modern-day emancipated world, he writes echoing Solomon Foster, the synagogue is willy-nilly the principal means of keeping alive Jewish consciousness. And then Kaplan adds a sentence whose implications for understanding modern American Jewry are far-reaching and still with us today. Why, asks and answers Kaplan, is the synagogue so important to American Jewry? He says, the synagogue is the only institution in America that can define our aims to a world which otherwise would be at a complete loss to understand why we Jews persist in retaining our corporate individuality. What Kaplan, in other words, is referring to in this rather complicated and unlovely sentence is the relatively new modern-day valuation of the synagogue. It is, after all, one of the ironies, in fact, one of the unintended consequences of modernity and of the emancipation process with which it's inextricably bound up, that the synagogue took pride of place in the modern Jewish world, looming larger than it ever had before. Once, the synagogue was one of many institutions that serviced the Jewish community. Now, under the conditions of modernity, it became the regnant Jewish institution. What's more, the particularities of America reinforced the religionizing of the Jews and their complete and utter transformation into a religious community. In the New World, then, the only socially acceptable way to express one's fidelity to Jewish culture and tradition was through religious communion. Will Herberg's classic 1955 text, Protestant Catholic Jew, an essay in American religious sociology, a volume that historian Martin Marty has described as the most honored discussion of American religion in mid-20th century times, Herberg's book represents the apotheosis of that process. Religion, Herberg declares in 1955, religion is accepted as a normal part of the American way of life. Not to be, that is, not to identify oneself and be identified as either a Protestant, a Catholic, or a Jew is somehow not to be an American. It's against that background, then, that Kaplan's 1918 statement, and I'll repeat it again, the synagogue is the only institution in America that can define our aims to a world that would otherwise be at a loss to understand why we persist in retaining our corporate individuality. It's against that background that this statement has to be understood. For not only does Kaplan's words anticipate Herberg by nearly 40 years, but more to the point, they underscore the extent to which this vision of the synagogue as Jewry's only legitimate address is imposed on American Jews. Ultimately, it's the outside non-Jewish world that provides this frame of reference and which sets this term of discussion. It's America, in other words, that subsumes cultural difference under the banner of religion. How else to explain in American terms Jewish corporate or collective individuality, asked Kaplan? It's simple, by defining the Jews as a church, much like the Methodists, the Congregationalists, the Baptists, and the Episcopalians. On the surface, at least, that definition seems to fit. In reality, that is, Jewish reality, the fit is awkward and constraining at best. As Kaplan demonstrated, both statistically and rhetorically, synagogue attendance, and with it implicitly the issue of affiliation, was a real problem for American Jews of an earlier generation. Reluctantly, the American Jewish community, by the interwar years, acknowledges that most American Jews are no longer worship-minded. By 1937, it's acknowledged synagogue attendance is at an all-time low ebb. Beyond that, though, the American Jewish community is completely unable to agree on the etiology of the problem, nor is it able, then as now, to generate a consensus on how best to ameliorate the situation. Well into the 1950s, American Jewry's cultural authorities generate a veritable laundry list of American Jewish and synagogal flaws whose variegatedness underscores the elusive complexity of modern American Jewry. For some observers, the problem began literally at the door with American synagogue architecture. Writing in 1908 in a prestigious trade journal, The American Architect, NYU Semitics professor A.S. Isaacs decries the popularity of Moorish-style synagogues with their delicate minarets, their stately domes, and their arabesque decorations. He says, There can be in America no greater anachronism than such designs on the banks of the Hudson or the Mississippi. A professor, by the way, whose preferences ran more towards Beaux-Arts than towards the Byzantine. A Moorish synagogue, he concludes, serves undoubtedly to strengthen the impression that the Jew is necessarily an alien and does not wish to be regarded as an American. And so she stays away. Others felt the problem had more to do with ample elbow room than with delicate minarets. Many synagogues, especially traditional Orthodox ones, presented what contemporaries described as the most dour appearance. They were too crowded, too noisy, poorly ventilated, with little space for women. Throughout, glumly reported one observer of the 19-teens, throughout, a subway rush hour spirit prevails. No wonder people stay away again. Some American Jews couched their indictment in more avowedly gendered terms, dismissing the synagogue as an institution for old men and middle-aged women. We really don't need it, an American Jewish family of the 1920s told the United Synagogue Reporter. The synagogue may be good enough for the old folks, for those with old parents, but not for us. More widespread still was the view that the synagogue, like the church, had become an overly feminized institution whose worshippers were largely women. Writing in 1931, Rabbi Jacob Cohen, author of the very popular parenting manual, Modern Problems of Jewish Parents, put it this way, urging men to attend religious services and drawing on a remarkably gendered turn of phrase. Says the good rabbi, if the concerns of Judaism and of Jewish life are of little moment to the father, and if the synagogue is the goal only of the mother's pilgrimage, and if the father regularly keeps his distance, then the son, don't care about the daughter, the son will draw the conclusion that religion in general and Judaism in particular are feminine accomplishments and Jewish life a feminine indulgence. Then there were those who believed that the synagogue's loss of appeal had nothing to do with gender or architecture and everything to do with class. In other words, it had lost its hold because it had grown much too expensive. Paying membership dues, renting seats for the high holy days, all of that kept out those of lesser means. Solomon Foster points out in 1909 that the method of American synagogue support is a bar to the participation of the poor. What's more, he continues, very few boards of directors have a representative of the poorer classes as a member. If our democratic American ideals would be logically applied, says Foster, there's little doubt but that working people would flock to the synagogue. Finally, and most extremely, were the views of those who found fault with the calendar, with Saturday as the Jewish day of rest. From where many Reform rabbis sat, the problem of dwindling attendance and indifference had nothing to do with the synagogue architecture, gender, or class, but with the time when synagogue services were held. On Saturday, a work day for most Americans well into the 1940s. Change the Sabbath, the Shabbat, to Sunday, they claimed, and the pews will be filled with worshipers. Well, when it came to tinkering with the calendar, nothing threw the problematics of the American synagogue into bolder relief than the high holy days. Then, as now, American Jews crowded into the pews of their local synagogues, generating what has come to be known as early as the 1900s as a Yom Kippur crowd. Casually observant most of the year, American Jews of early generations scrambled to purchase tickets to ensure their place in the sanctuary or in the so-called overflow service. As one observer noted way back in the 1890s, the very first premonition of the approach of fall is not the back-to-school sale, but the back-to-shul sale. Meanwhile, in cities throughout the nation, the demand for seats was so pronounced that enterprising ecclesiastical entrepreneurs rented theaters, catering halls, and movie palaces, along with the requisite clergy, to accommodate the demand. Known as provisional or temporary synagogues, sometimes they were known as mushroom synagogues, for their rather sudden, tentative burst on the landscape, these makeshift facilities aroused nothing but communal ire. Complains the Jewish Times of Baltimore in 1925, the American synagogue and Judaism in America as a whole will never succeed, will never make satisfactory progress as long as this system is in vogue. continues the Jewish Times, not only is the system detrimental to Jewish morale, it's positively destructive of every solid influence the synagogue may have. Still, regardless of venue, the autumnal burst of synagogue going vexed most observers. From the pulpit and the printed page, American Jewry's cultural authorities, then as now, railed against the seasonal worshiper. Sniffed one newspaper at the turn of the century, once again resorting to a rather gendered phrase, sniffs this paper. Many Jews have no use for congregational worship. They may even deride it, and yet, when the fall holidays arrive, they are not manly enough to persist in their indifference. Meanwhile, Mrs. Caesar Mish, appearing in 1911 before the National Council of Jewish Women, chides her female co-religionists for their sporadic ritual attentiveness. She says, again, 1911, "We are too prone to magnify 1 or 2 days in a year, to become Yom Kippur Jews, and to forget that the Sabbath, which comes every week, is as holy to the Lord as the holy days, which come only once a year." But as you know, Mrs. Mish's appeal goes unheeded. Just give you one more. Writing a generation later, in 1941, Trudy Weiss-Rosmarin takes a similar tact. In her guidebook to modern Jewish living, What Every Jewish Woman Should Know, a book subtitled The Intelligent Jewish Woman's Guide to Judaism, Weiss-Rosmarin, like so many before her, reminds her readers that the festivals of Sukkot and Shavuot found as much favor in the sight of the Lord as did Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. She says, "It's a sign of the complete and utter degeneration of Jewish life in America that both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur occupy such a prominent place in the calendar of present-day Jews. Although these holidays have a lovely and solemn air all their own, still," she says, "their observance is nowhere in Jewish law commanded more emphatically than the keeping of the other holidays." Well, the stuff of speeches, sermons, guidebook exhortations, lectures, the issue of temporary religiousness also appeared in the newspapers. And I urge you to take a look at this editorial page from the American Hebrew, September 28, 1900, Tishrei 5, 5661. It's right over here. Why don't you take a quick look at it, and then I'll attempt to pose some questions. I made it easy for underlining certain key passages, giving it away. Okay, anything strike you about this particular document? Well, faculty members? Anybody? Anything strike you?
Should have given me the answer.
Right, I think that's it. Well, what about its format? Where does this appear? Is this a sermon? No, sort of, but not quite.
It's an editorial.
It's an editorial. So doesn't it strike you as interesting, it certainly strikes me interesting, that the subject of what the columnist calls apprehensive religiousness appears as the subject of an editorial. It underscores, I think in a very graphic way, the topicality of the topic, at least in 1900. In fact, the Yom Kippur phenomenon is as much a part of the holiday ritual as buying new clothes or exchanging greeting cards. What about the tone of the piece? Is it mocking, satiric? Is there an edge? Is it happy about this Yom Kippur phenomenon?
It seems to be as angry about restaurants as it is about Yom Kippur Jews.
Well, it's angry in general, but let's just focus on the Yom Kippur business. Are there any phrases that leap off the page and capture your imagination? What about epidemic of religious apprehensiveness, right?
I would underline that. Spasm.
He uses the word affliction, religious fever, epidemic, possessed. It's a kind of a medical rhetoric that describes the impact, the sudden burst of attentiveness that comes over one, much as spring fever or some other kind of malady. It is, in short, a kind of seasonal disorder. And then it's kind of mocking. And at the end of it, the editorialist makes the point that despite this sudden embrace of shul going, people are as indifferent to religion after it as they were before it, and he mockingly talks about Mr. Isaac Indifferent, who, despite having gone to synagogue in 1900, not manly enough to persist in his indifference, still remains less than entranced by the American synagogue. Why do I bring this up? Well, I thought it might be fun for you to see tangibly, much as you saw Egon's statistics, the stuff of which history is written. To see in a very tangible way, much like Felice's exhibition, that American Jewish history is composed of people and editorials and ordinary tensions, and that phenomenon of tension is as ongoing as Jewish life itself. More to the point, though, and here I'd like to put it all together, the High Holy Days interrupted American Jewry's characteristic momentum, forcing the community to shift gears. The unsynagogued temporarily becomes the synagogued, only to revert back to their pre-holiday selves. Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Indifferent. The historicity of the High Holy Day syndrome is fascinating on its own. But more to the point, it's fascinating for what it reveals about American Jewry. At its most basic, this phenomenon dramatizes the chasm between the laity and its leaders, each of whom defined and continues to define Jewish allegiance in highly divergent ways. For the laity, the resonance of the High Holy Days came from the singularity of the occasion. For the laity, the High Holy Days epitomized the kind of gestural Judaism with which they were most at home. After all, in the alchemy of America, a new form of Jewish identity had taken hold. Jewishness, gestural Judaism, whose expression had as much and perhaps even more to do with feeling Jewish at heart than with ritual behavior or formal affiliation. More of an emotional sensibility than a matter of faith, behavior, or membership in a synagogue, gestural Judaism lay at the heart of the American Jewish experience. Detached from the recurring rhythms of the traditional Jewish calendar, this modern, singularly American version of Jewish identity anchored itself in the life cycle, the private life cycle, rather than the public communal arena. Most American Jewish leaders, though, were little prepared to acknowledge this new reality. And of them all, perhaps only Mordechai Kaplan was sufficiently attuned to what he called the intuitional basis of Jewish life to call for American Jewry's reconstruction. Surveying the contemporary scene, much like Foster and Weinberger before him, Kaplan pointed out in 1934 that if one doesn't have a taste for praying 3 times a day and studying the Bible and rabbinic writings, there's nothing in any of the current versions of Judaism to hold one's interest. How then to generate and sustain interest among latter-day Jews? By a far-reaching and fundamental act of redefinition and retrieval. By returning, in essence, to a pre-modern vision of Jewishness. Jewish identity, Kaplan tells us, is more than the sum of its sermons or its synagogues. Conceding, and this is a big point, conceding that we can no more separate a religion from a civilization than we can separate whiteness from snow or redness from blood, Kaplan insisted, nevertheless, that Jewish identity encompasses much more than just religious ritual. By Kaplan's life, Judaism, Jewishness, Jewish culture encompassed a history, a literature, a language, a social organization, folk sanctions, standards of conduct, social and spiritual ideals, and aesthetic values. In short, a civilization. When seen from that perspective, the synagogue, as narrowly constituted in America, could never possibly address the multiplicity of identities and needs which modern Jews brought to it. What is needed, Kaplan suggested, in a formulation that is as timely today, more than 60 years later, as timely today as it was when first written in 1934, what is needed, Kaplan said, is a Jewish civic organization, a kehillah to represent and display the totality of Jewish life. What is needed, Kaplan suggested, is a Beit Am, a community of feeling. In the absence of such an institution, Kaplan warned Judaism's survival, or as he put it, Judaism's day in America was not assured. But, he added with cautious optimism, should those people who labor on behalf of Judaism, should those people who labor on its behalf manifest and alert intelligence and a high idealism, Judaism will live. As those of us gathered at this conference apply our own version and vision of alert intelligence and high idealism to American Jewish matters, I hope we succeed in proving Kaplan right. Perhaps then Judaism, or more aptly, Jewishness, will live. Thank you.